So welcome everybody.
Welcome.
We are happy to host this interview with a esteemed musician, composer, and a lot more, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which is Chris Washburne. We have also in the house Armen Donelian, co-founder of HUDSON JAZZWORKS.
Hey, everybody.
And me, my name is Marc Mommaas, also part of HUDSON JAZZWORKS. And this is part of our composition module. We started this last year and was very successful, very inspiring, I can say. And so we would like to continue this and use it as a platform to get inspired by other composers and also to attract some attention to the composition process in general. A lot of people love the idea of composing, but it's an art form with a lot of detail, a lot of different corners to think about. So we bring in the pros to talk about this a little bit. Maybe Armen, you would like to say something?
Well, first of all, welcome to everybody, and just a few words about HUDSON JAZZWORKS. Mark and I have been doing this for, now we're going into our 15th year, and every summer we have a workshop up in Hudson, New York, and it's performance, composition, ear training, rhythm, ensemble playing, and then just life issues and how to practice and so on. And between Mark and I, we've been developing and honing this program, and we feel really excited to be here doing this today. And last summer, for the first time, due to COVID, we were thinking about, well, how could we, bring a different point of view to the workshop, because of we were restricted to mostly online, and we came up with this idea of the composition forum, and so we had 4 composers from around the world zooming in, and we spent a half an hour with each composer over 2 days. Was 2 hours, and we were like thrilled, like Mark said, about the way that the students were able to, learn, and it was fun for us, and so we decided to continue this. That's why we're here today. So, Chris, I want to start you off with a question. Let's see, I have about 6 questions here. I'll start with my favorite question. And this is because I love to teach counterpoint. The relationship between the horizontal and the vertical in composition, arranging, and orchestration is complex and seemingly infinite. In particular, the connection between a melodic motive and its formal development within a polyphonic context. What do you recommend to the young composer interested in exploring this vast landscape?
Wow, what a great question. I want to first say, before I answer that question, it'll give me time to think as well, is that I've had the opportunity to be a guest artist for your workshops in the summer. And I got to say that it was one of the most gratifying experiences that I had. And the fact that you guys have been doing it for 15 years is just absolutely wonderful and such a great resource. And that I hope that once we're back in action after COVID and things can open back up, you guys can continue to do that, because it's such a valuable resource for young musicians. And just to see them grow over the course of the couple days that I was there, it's just like on this accelerated path. So I guess the one way that I would answer that question is they should enroll into your workshop and work with you guys. Because just for the fact that you posed that question and you're thinking in that way, is lets us all know that you have a unique and a wide open global perspective of what composition is, what composition around that's associated with jazz is, and that the way that I would answer that is that in many ways, when you talk about polyphonic settings, right, it's a very Eurocentric way of thinking about music, because there's this huge tradition of polyphony and the development of polyphony within classical music. But of course, by definition, almost all music is polyphonic, no matter where it comes from. It doesn't really necessarily matter how we speak about it, what terms we use, as long as we can communicate. And so my approach to my own music is that I take these concepts that I learned in music school, which were coming from a classical tradition. I'm classically trained, and I went through like a theory sequence at a music school and learned counterpoint and learned all of these various ideas about how to think, vertically, how to think horizontally, and how the importance of the interaction of that. And I like to study music of the past and all different types of traditions and see and get inspired by what has happened before. So of course we start in music education with Bach usually when we're talking about counterpoint, and we're writing chorales and we're doing things like that. And Bach was exceptional. It's like a wonderful launching pad. But then what happens when you decide to go to a different place in the world, let's say Indonesia, and you listen to gamelan and gamelan music and hear those same type of relationships, because we hear from our own past and our own perspective, and to try to draw out, well, what is the relationship, the vertical and the horizontal, and how that the interplay is in those musics. And then we move into maybe some West African styles, such as from Ghana, some drumming styles, or some mbira music from Zimbabwe, and see what that can give us. And then what I will do, especially if I'm kind of, especially like with big band arranging, because big band arranging gives you great opportunity to deal with this, because you've got all of these voices. It's not just a small group. You can do it in small groups. When you have a large group, when you're going to arrange, one way to expand the possibilities in the palette within a jazz setting is to start to adapt some of those concepts that I learned elsewhere, where you think about how would Bach approach this shout chorus, or how would a traditional gamelan ensemble, if you applied those principles, how would it be? How would it be for a drumming ensemble, or let's say even like a Afro-Cuban drumming ensemble? How would that look like across the board? And you can see examples throughout jazz history where this has been applied and it has been really innovative. And one example is Charles Mingus. When you listen to Mingus's music, especially how he arranges even the smaller groups, it's oftentimes adopting these additive, almost like a West African drum ensemble, where every line is kind of simple, but as they get added on top and layered on top of it, it gets more and more complex really quickly, and it kind of infuses the music with energy. You can also look at the big band arranging styles of Tito Puente when he's writing for his big band. Same thing, thinking about Afro-Cuban drum ensemble and translating that into the horn section, where all the horns become drummers. And I think it infuses the music with vitality when you think globally. And we have that ability right now, that luxury, because Armen, I'm sure it was the case when you were a kid, and Mark and some of the other folks that are on this call, when we were growing up, we didn't have that resource called YouTube, and we didn't have the access, that immediate access to so many different musical styles. And so for me as a composer, when I get asked a question like that, Armen, I immediately try to expand the definition of what vertical and horizontal is, and then delve deeply into those different traditions, not superficially, but like really study them. Don't just go in and say, oh, I'm going to just, that it's the Stravinsky approach of going in and stealing a Lithuanian folk melody and inserting it into the beginning of the Rite of Spring, which was cool, and part of the Rite of Spring is all just folk melodies layered on top of one another. That's another example of thinking globally really early on. But what Stravinsky didn't do was spend a lot of time learning about Lithuanian folk music and actually how it's constructed, and use those principles as well. And, he wrote that in 1912, 1913. Now we have even a bigger global perspective than they had at that point. He's a product of his time. How are we products of our time? So I guess that would be the easiest way I could answer that question.
Yeah, I think you brought up some really good points. As you know, I played with Mongo Santamaria, and his Afro-Cuban style directly connects to Africa. And when I started playing in his band, of course, I had a lot of classical training before that and some jazz experience, but I had no experience playing in a Latin band at all. And I was shivering in my seat, you know, and I was like trying to figure out where's the beat, you know, where's one, where do I put my montuno? And so what it taught me was how to listen selectively. And by that I mean really just listen to one line. And I really focused on the bass and shut out all the other stuff that was going on in timbales and the cowbell and the congas, because I couldn't process it all until I could keep my place with the bass. And that took about, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, you know, of like constant playing. Eventually I could open up my ears a little bit more, and take in, oh, what's that conga doing? What's the cowbell doing? You know, oh, listen to that inflection that he's doing on that beat. He didn't do that in the last time. And so it was a form of ear training, as well as, you know, hearing these, you know, like you said, these layers, these lines going, and forming these, you know, just incredible rhythmic suspensions and syncopations. And so for me, it was an experience in ear training, and then that enabled me to like put it all together in my head and just know that, oh, well, that's what's going on, you know. So
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, people always say that, you know, the piano is a percussion instrument, and it is, you know, just by the nature of the mechanisms that create the sound. But I think that as a pianist, one of the best things that can happen to you is to get thrown into an Afro-Cuban or Afro-Puerto Rican setting or Afro-Latin setting, where it's a whole nother level of the piano being a percussion instrument, and see how that interacts. It's really wonderful. And to be in the strategy that you chose allowed you to just pick apart one of the pieces one at a time and hear it in relation to yourself. But in the end, what you end up doing is through your ear training, is you start to learn to hear culturally, and you hear cultural difference. You hear a diverse kind of a historical resonance from those legacies of where that music comes from, and immediately it broadens your own musicality. Because of course, once you internalize that, you carry that with you whenever setting you are or when you're writing, and then all of a sudden you have that resource. And I think that's the idea that I have, is that I'm a product of Gunther Schuler's third stream program at New England Conservatory, which was all about ear training and picking musical styles from around the world and really delving deep into it and being able to become fluent in those musical languages, and then use them to develop your own style. And I think that that's where that impetus comes from, of hearing globally, hearing broadly, and really not limiting yourself to within the confines of imagined, you know, traditions and canons and things like that.
Yeah.
It makes for much more interesting music.
Yeah, so I've noticed also, you know, when I think about your music and all the different styles that you have been associated with as a player and as a composer, which is incredibly vast. I mean, it's quite astounding. I also noticed that you spent time in Cuba, in Zambia, and I also noticed that, you know, when you get into something, you go all the way. You wrote some great books on salsa music. You know, what is bad music, and you know, it's really quite something. And what I found, and the question comes out of that, is that an earlier generation, which we are in, is when we had to get into something, you had to go there, which you obviously did. And there are some benefits from that, because when you go there, you don't only go to the music, you go to the culture, you go to the environment, you're going to smell the air, you're going to breathe the humanity that surrounds that music. What we find right now, there's a big advantage where what you say is everything is available to us. You know, you just go online and boom, there it is. But I would like to sort of talk a little bit about the challenges with that, which I see around me, which is that students, can get so quickly to it that they only go there for 5 minutes. And then they move on, and what then happens is that they know a lot. They know nothing about a lot, and that can also have sort of a negative effect on the composition. So my question is okay, What would be your advice to aspiring composers how to deal with this new reality?
Yeah, it's both a blessing and a curse. I think it's more a blessing than anything. Um, and I remember that the very first time that I came to New York City and I had a salsa gig, and sitting next to me was Barry Rogers on trombone, just coincidentally, like the greatest salsa trombone player of all time, and one of my heroes, musical heroes. So I was thrilled, and he was a very generous man, and between sets, I was talking a lot to him. At the end of it, and he was kind of helping me along and mentoring me throughout the gig, and it was a wonderful experience. And I remember that as soon as we finished the gig, he said, "Okay, what I need you to do is I need you to go out and buy a set of maracas, a cowbell, and a conga drum, and learn how to play them." In other words, I was even inside playing this music, and he was like, "You're not even close. Now you need to get deeper into it." And what I hear from some composers today is you hear that superficiality of giving a gesture or a nod to a certain type of music, but without that in-depth study and time and effort, it'll always remain superficial. It'll never take it onto a profound and innovative level. And so, but this requires discipline and patience and also the willingness to go further, whether it's just following down a rabbit hole down a YouTube channel, right? Or going on to I think Spotify is the devil, and I'm glad you're recording that in terms of their way they don't pay the musicians.
Right.
But Spotify and these other types of services also offer something really unique because let's say you hear Booker Little, like a track of Booker Little, and you're like, man, that guy can really play trumpet. And then you just do a search and listen to everything that they have from Booker Little, and it can take you through his entire catalog for some artists and not. And so that's the advantage of it. But are those young composers making that step? Are they actually doing that and listening deeply? But then it's not just listening to everything and internalizing it, but are you exploring what people have written about it? What are the resources that you can find? And then if it happens to be music of another culture, can you find those musicians to actually play with? Because in some ways, you're never going to get deep inside unless you're sitting next to Mongo Santa Maria and congas, and you have to figure out how to fit your piano part into that groove and where you play. And without that, your timing will not be correct, and it's going to take you'll never actually make it to the level that Armen could make it because he was sitting next to Mongo. So there's nothing can replace that experiential and those experiential moments when you're up close and personal to people that have really dedicated their lives to the music and the deepness that they have. And everybody knows that when they have a chance to play with elders that have been that are very successful and are it's a completely different experience. And we all know that. We've all played with jazz greats, and it's nothing you can learn from a recording. It's nothing you can learn from a book. It's through experience. And so during COVID, of course, we're limited in what we can do, but we can do a lot. And then once we're out of COVID, you need to go out and seek. And even as a composer, you need to know all the parts and learn how to play them. Become friends with people who play them really well, and take a lesson from Duke Ellington, right? Who actually was writing for specific players. And there's very few bands out there right now that do that. I think the greatest example, a living example, is Maria Schneider, how she is able to write for her specific instrumentalists. It's like each one of her pieces is almost like a concerto for one or two of the players. Her newest record that just won the Grammy, it's like a Ben Monder and concerto on some of those movements. It's just incredible how she's able to write for those specific instruments. And the only way she could do that is just know them so intimately well. So don't be cop-outs. Delve deeper, and you'll never get deep enough. There's never, a lot of people, they talk about how to become an expert in something, and you need to put like 10,000 hours in, right? Which is complete, as our president would say, poppycock. Because it's like, you know, for jazz musicians and for musicians alike, it's no such thing as 10,000 hours. It's a lifetime. And it's a lifetime of growth and learning. And if you do not have that kind of fire of wanting to be educated and self-educated and be educated by others, you know, you will have a very limited musical career. If you have the attitude that you're always a student and you're always growing and you're always opening to new ways, and that the more you learn, realize the more you don't know, and the more there is out there to know, that continual growth, those are the kind of musicians that we keep paying to see over our lifetimes. We keep hiring to be in our bands to like enrich us and to surprise us on every single gig. And the kind of composers that I love to play their music as they can constantly grow and change over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Chris. It brings to mind this expression by Shunryo Suzuki, Zen mind, beginner's mind. You know, the mind of the beginner is always going to be learning. The mind of the kind of self-described expert is closed, and they know all the answers, and they're not going to be growing very much. So, yeah, thanks for that thought.
Armen, you have some more questions?
Oh, well, actually, I do. Well, Chris touched on so many things, but you talked about, you know, where a young composer should start with listening and reading, writing, and or some combination of them all, and then developing vocabulary and rhythm, harmony, and melody. I guess the next issue for me would be how to approach form, and after developing competency in composing in different forms, such as blues changes or standard changes, and also reharmonizing a standard melody with different chords, and or composing a new melody like a contrafact over standard changes, then what's the next step? What do you recommend to a young composer regarding developing new, that is non-traditional compositional forms? What about the relationship to lyrics, if any, and or nature sounds, you know, or other ways of just, you know, expanding the formal concept to be open to, you know, different ways of developing the music. And the vamp is, of course, central to Latin music, but so much happens improvisationally during a vamp. A vamp is just the starting place for the development of a new form that is created in the moment, spontaneously. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting because you gave that little list of some summation of what I had said in terms of young composers, but I think the biggest thing that was missing was various life experiences and other art forms. You know, for me as a composer, I take in many ways way more inspiration by seeing a beautiful painting, or seeing a beautiful scene in nature, or hearing a piece of poetry, or just going to see theater. Anything that's like non-musical per se could be musical, not like going to see a gig or somebody. You can do that too to get inspired. But I think that if we look at the history of kind of formal development in jazz and also in classical music forms, the set formal structures like the dance suites that were used in the Baroque, and they moved into the classical era, and what happened when they got into the Romantic era, it started breaking down, and it was extra musical ideas that started dictating the form in interesting ways. And they called it program music, right? Where there would be some kind of program behind the music that would dictate the form. And in some ways, I don't see jazz as musicians. There are some examples, but there are not a lot of examples where there are musicians that are really trying to think about formal structures outside of the tradition. So you can always innovate from within, right? The blues form, the traditional blues form, can always be made your own in some ways, whether it's extending it by a few bars or by reharmonizing it in unique ways. It's, you can do that. But what would it be like to express the blues in not 12 bars, but if it was a blues that was limited to 10 bars or 15 bars, as simple as that? Or moreover, what if you were to go and see the work of Matisse or another famous artist that looked really bluesy? What would that sound like in music? And of course, we have examples of musicians going to the modern art, Sonny Rollins going to playing in front of a painting and improvising off the painting, and that's one example of improvising off of that. But what would that sound like in a song form?
What about Duke Ellington?
Well, I was going to just say, Duke Ellington was one of the few people that, especially with his mood pieces, where he was just trying to capture the mood becomes the form.
Right.
And that sentiment becomes the form. And for me as a listener, some of those pieces are the most compelling that I find that Duke wrote. And when I see musicians, more modern musicians, trying to do that and take inspiration from extra musical ideas, it's the simplest way to come up with unique and interesting forms. In other words, allow the story that you're trying to tell to dictate the form, as opposed to the formal structures dictating the musical choices that you make. Right. And there's nothing wrong with that one, because of course that's time tested, and great music can be written within the confines. In some ways, it's easier to compose and to play when you have strictures in place and structure in place, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah. But once you have mastered writing in those forms, the next level is to break away those structures and see where the music takes you, see where the story takes you from that. And something occurred to me when I was answering your question about the vertical and the horizontal. And I was having a conversation with contemporary composer Fred Laerdal, who was into writing about cognitive psychology and music and music and cognition, and was a theorist and a great composer himself. But when I would listen to his music, I could never hear the forms, but I could hear there was a formal structure in it. He said, I have stopped writing in traditional forms, and instead I enjoy spheres. And I always think in concentric circles and spheres when I write, and have the music unfold that way and the formal structure that way. And I thought to myself, my God, once he told me that, as soon as I started hearing his music, I could hear it. I could hear that was the impetus of the formal structure. And when I was playing with my more avant-garde group, Fear, the quartet, we started to write pieces that were in circular, like concentric or spirals or spheres, where the melody kind of goes like this and the improvisations go this and they contract. And all of a sudden, there was no formal structure that was related to the blues or the AABA or anything that we would normally see, but it was so freeing in terms of to improvise in that and to write in that way and try to hear in shapes, and that becomes the formal structure. So it's as simple as that. It's like, pick a triangle. What does a triangle sound like? Write a piece that's a triangle. Write a piece that's a circle, or if that a shape, or if it's just a mood, or it's a painting, and see what happens. And immediately the formal structure starts to change and opens up new avenues of ways of thinking.
Yeah, I was actually suggesting that when I said nature sounds too, but I guess
exactly. Another good example.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Eric Dolphy.
Yeah.
Eric Dolphy. Jim McNeely was talking about it also quite a bit, about the composing process and form, exactly the same way, thinking different cycles and different circles, and which is amazing. Now, one other question I always like to ask is, and I get it also when I get with students into composition, is the biggest question is always, where do I start? Because there are so many possibilities, right? Yep. And right now in this discussion, we even open it up. We open it up to the whole world, right? So these are all the possibilities, which is great. And this also ties in again with the overwhelming amount of information that goes online. So how would you start? What advice would you give to a aspiring composer that's just starting? Okay, if you want to start somewhere without being completely overwhelmed, what would be a good starting point?
The first note, one note.
I think Armen wrote a book about that called The Whole Note.
Well, actually, I had the same question, Mark. It was my first question, so you took it right out of my mouth. I said, what do you first recommend to students who want to compose? Where should they start? Is it with listening? Blah, blah, blah. But it seems to me like, this is just my opinion, but, they need to develop some kind of, like you were saying, Chris, some competency, some, firsthand experience with the basic elements of music so that they have some ground underneath their feet, and then from there then they can think about, well, gee, I want to go in this direction or that direction.
Yeah, but it's about, look, we are all born composers. Everybody is. If you don't believe me, take a 2-year-old and put them at a piano.
Oh yeah.
See what happens.
Right.
They're gonna compose something right on the spot. They're gonna improvise, right?
Right.
So that means that fundamentally we're all inherently creative. We're born that way. And then something really tragic happens to us, right? It's called preschool. And we go to preschool, and all of a sudden there's like all these rules we got to follow. Now preschool's important because it's starting to become, we're socializing, right? So we're learning how to share. But then what happens, we go into kindergarten and it just gets worse. The longer you're in school, the worse it gets because there's more of these rules. And I speak for myself. We as educators haven't figured out how to create an educational system that's open in such a way that it fosters that inner 2-year-old selves that we all have, that innate creativity and the innate ability. So by the time we get students, which oftentimes are in early college career or a little later college or right before college, they're like they've been put through the ringer in terms of squelching that ability. So when a new composer comes to me, aspiring composer, and says, where do I start? You already started when you were 2. Right. So our job is to not actually teach them composition, it's to facilitate a space where they can tap into that. And there's some simple ways to do it. And, just play around, like write the worst possible music you could imagine, just whatever comes to mind, stream of consciousness. If you're a trombone player, pick up and just improvise something. It doesn't matter what it is, no judgment, no inhibitions, and transcribe it. Transcribe what you just, record it and transcribe what you just did, and that's your first melody. And start with that and see what happens. And, usually it's pretty bad because they're too self-conscious. But as soon as you can get that self-consciousness out of there and you can get that notion of play and just having fun and messing around, I mean, for me, that's what composition is. It's just sitting in a sandbox and playing and imagining what the world could be, what it should be, and making it so. And trying to try different things out. The other thing too, to kind of instill, and this is a real hard one, is that there are no finished compositions. Composition is really a process. It's not a product. And so, you may have a tune that you want to record, right? And so you're going to capture the process at a moment. But that tune is not done evolving. And to use Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn again, of how they constantly rework their compositions. And they viewed composition as a process. They had the luxury of doing that because they could perform it every single night with a band, which is lovely, which oftentimes people can't do these days. But the idea is that you finish it, but you're not finished. You just got one iteration of it. And then go back to it and revisit it and rework it. That you start to grow like a whole. It's like you're tending to a vegetable garden, and that the plants are starting to grow, and they continue to grow. And the more that you can play around and come up with these ideas, the larger your palette is and your materials are as you move forward and as you compose and move forward and compose more and more. And when I first started composing, I remember it was like more seriously. I was in college by that time, even though I had written some things when I was younger. But I was forced to write a tune every single night. Whether it was 4 measures, 8 bars, 12 bars, 24 bars, 32 bars, I had to write a tune. That's all that, you know, and it didn't matter how good they were or how bad they were. I just had to write. And it was terrifying and horrible because like there would be some nights I'd be so tired I just don't want to do anything, and I would just write something because I wanted to finish it. And you know what? The next morning I wake up and those were some of my best compositions because I just didn't care. But also in the process of writing quantity as opposed to quality, I started to learn my craft. I started to be able to hear melodies and then be able to write them out without even sitting at the piano. So it was an ear training. It was like it was a slow developmental thing, but you just, so the other point is you start with one note, and the other thing is you just write every day. Even if it's just for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, write something. Come up with a bunch of bad ideas. Like aspire to bad ideas, and you know maybe one idea will actually be mediocre and the next day maybe something will be kind of good. I remember they were interviewing the guys who started Pixar movies, you know, and the Pixar films of like they've taken over like kids movies, and they asked them, they said, what's your secret when you're writing why to your success? And the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but he basically said, oh, that's easy, we aspire to write bad movies, period. And in the interview said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, I give the mandate to my team, write the worst movie you can possibly think of. And then we bring in all our bad movies and we look at them, and the least worst one, we decide to do another iteration of it. And then the goal of that iteration is just to be just above bad. In other words, taking the pressure out of excellence, taking the pressure out of doing something great, and just working at ideas and trying them out in experimentation. That's what composition is about. Yeah. And if you can get those inhibitions away, you'll end up one day actually coming up with something pretty cool, and maybe more than just cool.
Yeah, I think removing self-judgment and fear from the process is really key to the whole thing, and letting self-expression happen.
Yeah, and I think we as teachers have to be careful to, you know, treat that very delicately and very non-judgmentally when students come in and they bring something that is definitely subpar, let's say, and finding the value and the beauty of that and using that as a learning experience to even grow. And I find that one of the most challenging when I'm speaking to young composers, and to try to figure out exactly the way to communicate the most supportive response to whatever it is that they're bringing in.
Yeah, well, even that whole idea of subpar is a judgment that we put on ourselves, you know. Yeah. It's all inside us.
Yeah, yeah. But and one of the things is that for me, I just need to be honest. I'm looking at something, I'm not saying out loud, I'm thinking, this is subpar. I wish that this person had brought something better in. But then I'm like having to step back and evaluate, where is that judgment coming from? And then kind of go into working with them, not from that place, but from a very a place of kindness and of support, and also of enthusiasm, to push them more and say, okay, write more, run with this idea.
That's beautiful. It's such a huge lesson, and so inspiring what you just mentioned. Reminded me when I was really stuck in a composition, and my piano chops are not fantastic. So after a whole day on the same couple of chords, my wrists were falling off and everything. And so then I took a break and I looked at a documentary of Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg is a great artist, and they showed how he was working. And it was amazing to me. What he did, he put a piece of paper on the floor, he had paint, and he go, pam, 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 done, next. And then pam, 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 done, next. And he would do like 100 of them and then get a cup of coffee or have lunch. And then from those 100, maybe 10 of them were really fantastic. And I decided right after that, that's it. I'm going to try that. I'm going to write whatever I hear. If on a dime I hear something else, I write it down. And as what you said, I didn't think it was going to work, and it became one of my, got on the record, got on my first record, and I'm still very proud of it. And when I listen back to it, yes, there are compositional things that I would have changed, but I even love the stuff that were rough on the edges because of the energy behind it. And, you know, so many incredible points that you just put on the table in such a fast pace with such deep understanding. I really highly appreciate your knowledge here because it comes from expertise.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Armen, do you have another last question for the roads?
No, well, I think I'm about done. I think we are almost out of time, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
But Chris, man, and I knew this was going to be inspiring because I saw you in action at our intensive when you came in, and it was memorable. I can tell you that. I was inspired and was blown away by how you handled it. You came in and blew everybody away. So it's no surprise that again you blow me away with such a great presence, with such great inspiration. So really, truly, we thank you.
thank you, Chris.
For your great presence here.
Yeah, we really appreciate your participation and wish you the best. Yeah.
You too, and everybody, please stay safe. And just remember one thing: jazz emerged as the music, the most popular music in the world, in the aftermath of the Spanish flu. It is the music that is most suited for adaptability and change, which means that the kind of music that's going to emerge in the next few years as we emerge out of COVID is going to be mind-boggling and mind-blowing. So put your seatbelts on and enjoy the ride and join in it and take this opportunity to really do some amazing things in this music.
That's awesome, Chris. All right,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Take care, everybody.
All right, that concludes our interview. We are going to continue with John, this is just in private. So we ask everybody to log out, except for John, because we are going to get into to composition, which is part of our more in-depth composition process. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Gerald is still cooking. He will.
Okay.